the $100 million espionage scandal that almost destroyed Formula One. Picture this. It's July 2007. The most dominant team in Formula One history is about to be ripped apart by a scandal so explosive, so unthinkable, that it will threaten the very existence of the sport itself. Inside a cramped apartment in Surrey, England, a Ferrari engineer's wife makes a discovery that will trigger the biggest espionage case in motorsport history. What she finds isn't drugs. It isn't evidence of an affair. It's something far more valuable. Something worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Something that will drag two of the world's most iconic brands through the mud, destroy careers, end friendships, and nearly bankrupt a racing team. This is the story of Spygate. The Formula One scandal that had everything: betrayal, corporate espionage, courtroom drama, and enough twists to make a Hollywood thriller look boring. And here's the kicker. Most people still don't know the full story. By the end of this video, you'll understand why one photocopier, one jealous wife, and 780 pages of technical documents nearly brought down an empire. But first, we need to go back to where it all began. Before we dive into the scandal that rocked the racing world, you need to understand what was at stake. And trust me, it wasn't just about winning races. Formula One isn't just a sport. It's a multi-billion-dollar global circus where nations compete through their automotive champions, where brands spend ungodly amounts of money for a few seconds of glory, and where the difference between first and second place can be measured in thousandths of a second. In 2007, two teams stood at the absolute pinnacle of this sport: Ferrari and McLaren. These weren't just racing teams. They were titans, legends, institutions with histories stretching back decades. Ferrari, the crimson dream of Enzo Ferrari himself, had dominated the early 2000s with Michael Schumacher at the wheel, winning 5 consecutive world championships. They were the team everyone feared, the benchmark, the gold standard. McLaren, dressed in sleek chrome and red, represented British engineering excellence. Founded by the legendary Bruce McLaren, they'd won championships, produced iconic cars, and employed some of the greatest drivers ever to sit in a cockpit. By 2007, they had a weapon that could finally challenge Ferrari's dominance: a young, hungry two-time world champion named Fernando Alonso and a rookie sensation named Lewis Hamilton. The stage was set for an epic season. Ferrari versus McLaren. Experience versus youth. Italian passion versus British precision. Nobody could have predicted that behind the scenes, one of the most audacious acts of industrial espionage in corporate history was already underway. A scheme so brazen, so reckless, that when it finally came to light, it would make Watergate look like a parking violation. This is that story. Every twist, every betrayal, every moment that made grown men lie under oath and billion-dollar corporations tremble. And it all started with a photocopier. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change how you see Formula One forever. The golden boy who wanted more. Let's start with Nigel Stepney. If this story has a villain, he's it. But like all great villains, he didn't start out that way. Nigel Stepney was a Formula One lifer. He'd spent over 2 decades at Ferrari, rising through the ranks from a mechanic to become the chief mechanic, one of the most trusted positions in the entire organization. This guy wasn't some low-level employee photocopying documents in the mailroom. He was a key figure in Ferrari's dynasty. He'd been there for all 5 of Michael Schumacher's championships. He knew the cars inside and out. He knew the systems, the innovations, the secrets that made Ferrari the most successful team of the modern era. But here's where human nature comes into play. By 2006, Stepney was getting restless. Michael Schumacher had retired. The glory days felt like they were ending. And more importantly, Stepney felt underappreciated. He wanted more. More money. More recognition. More power within the organization. According to later testimony, Stepney had approached Ferrari management about getting a promotion, a bigger role, perhaps even a technical director position. The answer he got back? Thanks, but no thanks. Ferrari had other plans. They were restructuring. They had other people in mind. Stepney would remain where he was. Now, most people would dust themselves off and move on. Maybe start looking for opportunities at other teams. Maybe accept their role and keep working. But Nigel Stepney wasn't most people. He was angry. He felt betrayed. And anger mixed with intimate knowledge of Ferrari's deepest secrets is a dangerous combination. Across the paddock at McLaren, another key player enters our story, Mike Coughlin, the engineer with everything to lose. Mike Coughlin was McLaren's chief designer. Like Stepney, he wasn't some junior employee. This was a man at the very top of his field, responsible for designing the cars that would compete for world championships. He'd been with McLaren for years, had a stellar reputation, and was living the dream that every engineer in motorsport fantasizes about. But Coughlin had a weakness. He was obsessively competitive. He wanted McLaren to win, and he wanted to be the guy who made it happen. In the pressure cooker environment of Formula One, where teams spend hundreds of millions of dollars searching for tiny advantages, that obsession can make you do things you'd never normally consider. Here's what we know. Sometime in late 2006 or early 2007, Stepney and Coughlin started talking. They knew each other from the Formula One circuit. It's a small world at the top of motorsport. Everyone knows everyone. But these conversations went beyond casual paddock gossip. According to court documents and testimony that would later emerge, Stepney was angry with Ferrari and looking for revenge. Coughlin was hungry for any advantage that could help McLaren beat their rivals. It was a toxic combination. A betrayed insider with access to everything, and an obsessed engineer willing to cross lines that should never be crossed. And then, at some point in this relationship, a line was crossed that there was no coming back from. Stepney started feeding Coughlin information. Not just any information. We're talking about Ferrari's crown jewels. Technical specifications. Design philosophies. Weight distribution data. Detailed drawings. Information about Ferrari's 2007 car and even their plans for 2008. This wasn't a few photos snapped at a race. This was a systematic, deliberate theft of intellectual property on a massive scale. The package that changed everything. Here's where it gets crazy. Stepney didn't just email this stuff. Remember, this was 2007. Digital security was tighter, and people were paranoid about electronic trails. So what did he do? He compiled physical documents. We're talking about a dossier that would eventually be revealed to contain 780 pages of highly confidential Ferrari technical information. 780 pages. To put that in perspective, that's not a couple of sketches or some general data. That's essentially a blueprint for how Ferrari built their championship-winning cars. That's the kind of information that teams spend hundreds of millions of dollars and decades of experience developing. Information that, in the wrong hands, could completely undermine a competitor's advantage. And Coughlin wanted copies. This is where the story becomes almost darkly comedic in its audacity. Mike Coughlin took these 780 pages of stolen Ferrari documents to a local print shop in Surrey, England. Not a high-security copy center. Not some underground espionage facility. A regular, everyday print shop that probably also made wedding invitations and restaurant menus. The date was March 2007. Coughlin walked in with this massive stack of technical documents covered in Ferrari logos and highly detailed engineering schematics, and asked the staff to make copies. Now, you might be thinking, didn't anyone notice? Didn't anyone think this was weird? Well, yes. Some of the employees did think it was strange. But this is the UK. People mind their own business. Coughlin was a respectable-looking middle-aged man in a nice area. He paid for the service. They made the copies. He left. But here's the thing about secrets this big. They never stay secret for long. And the person who would blow this whole thing wide open wasn't a whistleblower or a journalist or a rival team member. It was Mike Coughlin's wife. Let me paint you a picture of domestic life in the Coughlin household in the spring of 2007. Mike Coughlin is working insane hours, as Formula One engineers do. The season is underway. McLaren is actually competitive for the first time in years. They have Fernando Alonso, a two-time world champion, and Lewis Hamilton, this incredible rookie who's matching him point for point. Everything should be perfect. But Trudy Coughlin, Mike's wife, notices something off. Her husband is stressed. More stressed than usual. He's secretive about certain phone calls. He's got stacks of technical documents around the house, which isn't unusual for an F1 designer. But there's something different about these ones. According to later reports, Trudy became curious, maybe suspicious. She started looking through some of Mike's papers. And what she found made her blood run cold. Page after page of technical drawings and specifications, all marked with Ferrari logos. Now, Trudy Coughlin wasn't naive. She knew her husband worked for McLaren. She knew what Ferrari was. And she knew that having your rival's confidential technical documents in your home office was not part of any legitimate engineering exchange. She confronted Mike. The details of that conversation have never been made fully public, but we know what happened next. Whether out of guilt, fear, or genuine concern about the legal implications, the Coughlins made a decision. But here's the twist that makes this story so incredible. They didn't go to McLaren management. They didn't go to the police. They didn't go to the FIA, Formula One's governing body. Trudy Coughlin called Ferrari. Let me say that again. The wife of McLaren's chief designer called Ferrari's offices in Maranello, Italy, and tried to talk to someone about the documents her husband had. According to some reports, she was trying to understand if this was legitimate information sharing or something more sinister. According to others, she was trying to do the right thing and return the documents. The call didn't go well. Communication broke down. Language barriers might have been an issue, but word of the call eventually filtered up through Ferrari's organization. And when Ferrari's leadership heard that someone from McLaren was calling about their confidential technical documents, alarm bells started ringing. Ferrari strikes back. Now put yourself in Ferrari's shoes for a moment. You're the most successful Formula One team of the modern era. You've just heard that someone associated with your main rival has been calling your offices about confidential technical documents. What do? Ferrari didn't mess around. They launched an internal investigation. Who had access to these documents? How did they get out? Was this still happening? The investigation led them quickly to Nigel Stepney. Remember him? The longtime Ferrari employee who'd felt passed over for promotion? When Ferrari's security team started digging, they found evidence that Stepney had been accessing files he didn't need for his job, that he'd been making copies of sensitive documents, that he'd been in regular contact with Mike Coughlin at McLaren. On July 3, 2007, Ferrari made their move. They didn't just fire Stepney. They filed a criminal complaint with the Italian police for industrial espionage, and they filed a lawsuit against Stepney and persons unknown for theft of trade secrets. The persons unknown? That was about to include McLaren. The dominoes began to fall. When news broke that Ferrari had filed criminal charges against one of their own employees for espionage, the Formula One world went into shock. This stuff just didn't happen. Sure, teams tried to poach each other's employees. Sometimes information leaked. But actual espionage charges? Criminal investigations? This was unprecedented. McLaren initially tried to distance themselves from the scandal. Ron Dennis, McLaren's principal at the time and a man who prided himself on integrity and honesty, made public statements expressing shock at the allegations. McLaren's official position was clear. They knew nothing about any stolen Ferrari documents. This was the unauthorized action of one rogue employee who had now been suspended pending investigation. But Ferrari wasn't buying it. They had phone records. They had evidence that Coughlin and Stepney had been in frequent contact. They had testimony from the print shop employees about the 780 pages of copied documents. And they were convinced that this information had made its way into McLaren's 2007 car design. On July 26, 2007, Ferrari formally requested that the FIA, Formula One's governing body, investigate McLaren for possessing confidential Ferrari information. This wasn't just a civil lawsuit anymore. This was going to the highest authority in the sport. The FIA scheduled a hearing. Ron Dennis was summoned to Paris to answer questions. Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton, McLaren's drivers, were told they might need to give testimony. The entire paddock was buzzing with rumors and speculation. What happened in those July 2007 days? Did McLaren use the Ferrari information? How much did senior management know? Were the drivers involved? These questions were about to tear McLaren apart from the inside. The first hearing, a shocking verdict. On July 26, 2007, the FIA's World Motorsport Council convened to hear Ferrari's accusations against McLaren. This was the trial of the century for Formula One. Representatives from both teams packed into the hearing room. Lawyers lined the walls. The stakes could not have been higher. McLaren's defense was straightforward. Yes, Mike Coughlin had somehow obtained Ferrari documents. Yes, this was a massive breach of trust and ethics. But McLaren, the organization, had not known about it. Senior management had not known. The designers had not used this information. Coughlin had acted alone, kept the information to himself, and would be fired. Ron Dennis, under oath, testified that McLaren had not benefited from the stolen information. He maintained that the team had conducted an internal investigation and found no evidence that Ferrari data had been incorporated into their car designs or race strategies. Ferrari, on the other hand, painted a picture of systematic espionage. They pointed to the sheer volume of documents, 780 pages. They highlighted the frequent communications between Stepney and Coughlin. They argued that information this detailed and extensive couldn't have stayed with just one person. Someone else had to know. The hearing lasted hours. Testimony was given. Evidence was presented. And then, the FIA made a decision that shocked everyone. McLaren was found to have possessed unauthorized Ferrari documents, but they were not punished. The council ruled that there was insufficient evidence that the information had been used, that McLaren's 2007 car appeared to have been designed independently, that while Coughlin's actions were reprehensible, they were the actions of an individual, not the team. Ferrari was furious. Ron Dennis was relieved. The Formula One community was stunned. But here's the thing about scandals this big. The truth has a way of coming out. And what was about to emerge would make that first hearing look like a gentle warm-up. Because inside McLaren, tensions were boiling over. And one driver was about to blow the whole thing wide open again. Trouble in paradise. While the espionage scandal was unfolding in courtrooms and FIA headquarters, another drama was playing out inside McLaren's garage. And it involved two of the fastest drivers on the planet who absolutely could not stand each other. Fernando Alonso had come to McLaren as the golden boy. He was a two-time world champion. He'd left Renault, where he'd won both his titles, specifically to come to McLaren because he believed they had the car to win. He was supposed to be the team leader, the number one driver, the man around whom everything revolved. But there was a problem. A massive problem named Lewis Hamilton. Lewis Hamilton was a rookie in 2007, 22 years old, unproven at the highest level. But from the very first race of the season, he was fast. Not just fast, he was matching Alonso, beating him sometimes, taking points from him, getting preferential treatment from certain members of the team who saw him as the future. McLaren, to their credit, tried to treat both drivers equally. Equal strategies, equal opportunities. But Alonso hadn't signed up for equal treatment. He'd signed up to be the number one. And watching this kid, this rookie, get the same status was eating him alive. By mid-season, the relationship between Alonso and Hamilton was toxic. They weren't speaking to each other. Their relationship with Ron Dennis was strained. And most critically, Alonso felt that McLaren management was favoring Hamilton. In Hungary, in August 2007, things came to a head. During qualifying, Alonso deliberately disobeyed team orders and held Hamilton up in the pit lane, preventing him from completing a final flying lap. It was a blatant act of sabotage. The FIA penalized Alonso, demoting him on the grid. McLaren was humiliated. Ron Dennis was livid. But Alonso had a card to play. A nuclear card that he'd been holding on to. And he was about to play it. The blackmail. Here's where this story goes from corporate espionage to something out of a thriller novel. In the aftermath of the Hungary incident, Fernando Alonso had a private meeting with Ron Dennis. What was said in that meeting has been the subject of speculation and partial testimony, but here's what we know happened. Alonso told Dennis that he had information about the Ferrari documents. Information that went beyond Mike Coughlin acting alone. He had evidence, emails and text messages, showing that other McLaren staff members, possibly including senior personnel, had known about the Ferrari information and had discussed using it. And here's the kicker. Alonso allegedly told Dennis that if McLaren didn't give him preferential treatment over Hamilton for the rest of the season, he would take this information to the FIA. Let that sink in for a moment. A driver, employed by McLaren, threatening to expose the team to the sport's governing body unless he got what he wanted. Ron Dennis was in an impossible position. If Alonso's information was legitimate, and it showed that McLaren had lied to the FIA in the first hearing, the consequences would be catastrophic. Not just a fine, not just a points deduction, potential disqualification from the championship, possible expulsion from Formula One entirely, criminal charges. But if Dennis gave in to Alonso's demands, he'd be admitting the guilt and setting a precedent that drivers could blackmail teams. Ron Dennis made his choice. He refused Alonso's demands. And then, in an act that would define his character in this scandal, he did something that shocked everyone. He went to the FIA himself. The emails that changed everything. On September 13, 2007, Ron Dennis met with Max Mosley, the president of the FIA, and presented him with new evidence. Evidence that he'd only recently discovered, he claimed. Evidence that changed everything. The evidence consisted of emails and text messages exchanged between Mike Coughlin, Pedro de la Rosa, McLaren's test driver, and Fernando Alonso. These messages revealed something that McLaren had vehemently denied in the first hearing, that multiple members of the team had knowledge of the Ferrari information and had, in fact, discussed using it. One email from De La Rosa to Alonso discussed Ferrari's weight distribution. Another talked about Ferrari's tire gas specifications, critical information about how Ferrari prepared their cars for races. A text message showed Alonso asking about a specific Ferrari setup detail that he wanted to try on his own car. This wasn't Mike Coughlin acting alone. This was multiple team members, including drivers, discussing confidential Ferrari information and actively considering how to use it to gain an advantage. The FIA was stunned. They'd exonerated McLaren just weeks earlier. Now they had evidence that McLaren had lied, or at minimum, had conducted an inadequate internal investigation and misled the council about the extent of the information sharing. Max Mosley immediately called for a second hearing. This time, McLaren wouldn't get off so easily. The media firestorm. When news broke that there would be a second FIA hearing and that new evidence had emerged involving driver communications, the media went absolutely insane. Every sports publication, every news outlet, every Formula One fan forum erupted with speculation. What did the emails say? How much had McLaren cheated? Should they be thrown out of the championship? What about Hamilton's rookie season? Was it legitimate, or was it built on stolen Ferrari data? Fernando Alonso tried to distance himself from the scandal, claiming he'd merely been asking innocent questions and hadn't realized the information came from Ferrari. Lewis Hamilton maintained he'd known nothing about any Ferrari documents. Ron Dennis looked exhausted and defeated in every public appearance. Ferrari, sensing blood in the water, pushed hard for maximum penalties. They wanted McLaren disqualified from the 2007 championship. They wanted their points stripped. They wanted heads to roll. The second FIA hearing was scheduled for September 13, 2007. And this time, the entire world was watching. September 13th, Judgment Day. The FIA World Motorsport Council chambers in Paris had never seen anything like this. When the second hearing into the McLaren espionage scandal convened on September 13, 2007, it wasn't just about racing anymore. This was about corporate integrity, about the future of Formula One, about whether the sport could tolerate industrial espionage at the highest levels. Ron Dennis walked into that hearing knowing his team's reputation hung in the balance. He was accompanied by McLaren's lawyers, technical directors, and prepared to face the toughest questioning of his career. Ferrari's legal team was there in force. They'd prepared a devastating presentation that laid out the timeline of the espionage, the evidence of information sharing, and the case for why McLaren should face the harshest possible penalties. Max Mosley presided over the hearing with an air of stern disappointment. He'd trusted McLaren's testimony in the first hearing. He'd given them the benefit of the doubt. Now he felt deceived, and he wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The evidence laid bare. The FIA's investigators presented their findings in excruciating detail. Here's what they'd uncovered. First, the 780 pages of Ferrari documents that Coughlin possessed weren't just technical drawings. They included detailed weight distribution data for Ferrari's 2007 car, tire gas specifications and pressure settings, aerodynamic configurations, suspension geometry, brake system designs, strategic information about Ferrari's development plans for the 2008 season. This was the kind of information that teams guard more closely than nuclear codes. In Formula One, where a tenth of a second per lap can be the difference between winning and losing, this data was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in research and development. Second, the communications between McLaren personnel proved that the information hadn't stayed with Mike Coughlin. The emails recovered by investigators showed Pedro de la Rosa is emailing Fernando Alonso about Ferrari's weight distribution, asking if Alonso wants to try a similar setup. Discussions about Ferrari's tire gas mixture, with McLaren staff debating whether they should experiment with similar specifications. Text messages between Alonso and an unnamed McLaren engineer about specific Ferrari setup details. Evidence that de la Rosa had shared Ferrari information with other members of McLaren's engineering team. Third, and perhaps most damning, McLaren's internal investigation after the first hearing had been woefully inadequate. When Ron Dennis testified in July that McLaren had found no evidence of information misuse, he either hadn't looked hard enough or had deliberately avoided finding what was there. The FIA investigators found the incriminating emails within days of being given access to McLaren's systems. How had McLaren missed them? McLaren's defense crumbles. McLaren's legal team tried to mount a defense, but it was like trying to hold back a tsunami with a tennis racket. They argued that the emails showed discussions about Ferrari data, but not actual implementation. Talking about trying Ferrari's setup was different from actually using it. The 2007 McLaren car had been designed before most of this information sharing occurred and therefore couldn't have been influenced by it. They emphasized that Lewis Hamilton, who was leading the Drivers' Championship, had not been involved in any of the email exchanges and had no knowledge of the Ferrari information. They argued that punishing the entire team for the actions of a few individuals was disproportionate. They even tried to argue that some of the information Stepney provided was deliberately false, sabotage designed to mislead McLaren rather than help them. Stepney, they claimed, had tried to feed McLaren bad data to hurt their performance. But the FIA wasn't buying it. Max Mosley made clear his position. McLaren had possessed confidential Ferrari information. Multiple McLaren personnel had known about it. They had discussed using it. And McLaren management had either been complicit or been negligent in preventing its use. Either way, the team was responsible. The question wasn't whether McLaren was guilty. The question was, what punishment fit this unprecedented crime? The verdict that shook the world. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the FIA World Motorsport Council delivered its verdict. McLaren was found guilty of fraudulent conduct and bringing the sport into disrepute. The penalties were swift and brutal. Penalty 1. McLaren was excluded from the 2007 Constructors' Championship. Every point they'd scored that season, the points that had them leading the championship, was stripped away. In one moment, they went from championship leaders to having 0 points. They would not appear in the final standings. They would not collect any prize money from the championship. It was as if their season had never happened. Penalty 2. McLaren was fined $100 million US dollars. Let me repeat that. $100 million. The largest fine in sporting history. Larger than any fine ever imposed in Formula One by a factor of about 10. It was a penalty designed not just to punish, but to send a message to every team in every motorsport series in the world. Industrial espionage will not be tolerated. Penalty 3. McLaren would remain under intense FIA scrutiny for years to come. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion of rule-breaking, would result in immediate and severe sanctions. There was, however, one silver lining, if you could call it that. The FIA chose not to strip points from McLaren's drivers in the 2007 championship. Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso would be allowed to compete for the driver's title with the points they'd earned. The FIA's reasoning? The driver's championship was about individual performance, and there wasn't sufficient evidence that Hamilton or Alonso had deliberately used Ferrari information to gain an unfair advantage in races. Also, the political reality was that stripping Hamilton's points would have fundamentally altered the championship battle and created an even bigger scandal. This decision was controversial. Ferrari argued that if McLaren's car was designed with stolen information, then the drivers benefited from it, and their points should be removed. But the FIA held firm. The drivers could continue. The team was done. The aftermath of the verdict. When the verdict was announced, reactions ranged from shock to vindication to fury. Ferrari's team principal, Jean Todt, called it a step in the right direction, but maintained that McLaren's drivers should have been punished too. Ferrari's president, Luca di Montezemolo, was more blunt, saying the penalty showed that justice had been done and that cheating has no place in Formula One. Ron Dennis looked like a man who'd aged 10 years in 10 hours. In his statement after the hearing, he was defiant and apologetic in equal measure. He accepted the FIA's decision, pledged that McLaren would pay the fine and comply with all sanctions, but maintained that McLaren's 2007 car had not been designed using Ferrari information and that the team's performance was legitimate. Lewis Hamilton, still just a rookie, tried to stay focused on racing. He was in the middle of an intense battle for the Drivers' Championship with both Alonso and Ferrari's Kimi Räikkönen. The scandal swirling around him was a massive distraction, but he maintained his innocence and his focus. Fernando Alonso? He went quiet, very quiet. His role in exposing the emails had made him a controversial figure. Some saw him as a whistleblower who'd done the right thing. Others saw him as a traitor who'd blackmailed his own team. Either way, his relationship with McLaren was beyond repair. But here's what everyone was thinking as they left that Paris hearing room. How would this affect the championship? There were still 4 races to go in the 2007 season. Hamilton and Alonso were both in contention for the title, and now they were racing for a team that had just been declared guilty of espionage and fined $100 million. The drama was far from over. Racing under the shadow. Imagine trying to win a world championship while your team is embroiled in the biggest scandal in the sport's history. That was the reality for Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso in the final races of the 2007 season. The Japanese Grand Prix at Fuji was the first race after the FIA verdict. The tension in the McLaren garage was suffocating. Ron Dennis tried to keep everyone focused on racing. But how do you ignore the fact that your team has just been fined $100 million and thrown out of the championship? Hamilton and Alonso weren't even speaking to each other by this point. They were teammates in name only. Each had its own side of the garage, its own engineers, its own race strategies. They shared nothing except the McLaren logo on their race suits. Adding to the drama, Ferrari's Kimi Räikkönen was now a real threat for the title. While McLaren's drivers had been taking points from each other all season in their internal battle, Räikkönen had been quietly racking up podium finishes. Going into the final races, all 3 drivers, Hamilton, Alonso, and Räikkönen, had a mathematical shot at the championship. The media coverage was relentless. Every press conference became an interrogation. Every practice session was analyzed for signs that McLaren might still be using Ferrari information. The scrutiny was intense, invasive, and never-ending. China, where it all fell apart. The Chinese Grand Prix, the penultimate race of the season, was where Hamilton's dream season turned into a nightmare. Hamilton came into Shanghai leading the championship. He just needed to finish the race in the points to almost guarantee himself the title in his rookie season. It would have been one of the greatest underdog stories in sports history. But fate, and a critical miscalculation by McLaren, had other plans. Late in the race, Hamilton was running in a comfortable position when his team told him to stay out on worn tires for one more lap before pitting. The tires were shot. Hamilton radioed multiple times saying they were finished and he needed to come in. The team kept telling him to stay out. On the entry to the pit lane, Hamilton's tires were so worn that he couldn't slow the car properly. He ran straight into the gravel trap at the pit entry and beached the car. He was stuck. Race over. 0 points. In one moment, Hamilton's comfortable championship lead evaporated. The conspiracy theories exploded immediately. Did McLaren deliberately sabotage Hamilton's race? Was Ron Dennis punishing him for something? Was this payback for the Alonso drama? The more likely explanation was simpler but no less painful. McLaren made a strategy error under immense pressure. The team was falling apart emotionally and organizationally. The Spygate scandal had taken its toll. Everyone was stressed, exhausted, and making mistakes. Alonso finished second in China, keeping his championship hopes alive. Räikkönen won, taking the lead in the championship. Everything would come down to the final race in Brazil. Brazil, the stunning conclusion. The 2007 Brazilian Grand Prix wasn't just the season finale. It was a 3-way shootout for the World Championship between Hamilton, Alonso, and Räikkönen. Any of them could win the title depending on where they finished. The race was tense beyond belief. Hamilton, trying to recover from the China disaster, needed a strong result. Alonso needed to win and hope Hamilton finished poorly. Räikkönen just needed to outscore both of them. From the start, Hamilton struggled. He didn't have the pace. Ferrari was faster. Alonso was faster. As the race unfolded, Hamilton dropped down the order. By the midpoint, he was running 7th, not good enough for the championship. Meanwhile, up front, Räikkönen was dominant. He took the lead and never looked back, winning the race in commanding fashion. Alonso finished 3rd, but it wasn't enough. When the checkered flag fell, Kimi Räikkönen was the 2007 Formula One world champion by just 1 point. 1 point. After everything that had happened, the espionage, the scandal, the internal warfare at McLaren, the championship came down to a single point. Lewis Hamilton finished third in the championship, just 1 point behind Räikkönen. In any other season, a rookie finishing third would have been celebrated as an incredible achievement. But this wasn't any other season. Hamilton had been so close to winning it all that finishing third felt like failure. Fernando Alonso also finished third overall, tied on points with Hamilton but ranked behind him on countback. After all the drama, all the blackmail, all the betrayal, Alonso ended up with nothing. No championship, no good relationship with McLaren. Just the knowledge that he'd been part of the biggest scandal in Formula One history. The real cost of Spygate. The $100 million fine was just the beginning of the price McLaren paid for Spygate. Financially, the team took a massive hit. Not just from the fine itself, but from the loss of Constructors' Championship prize money. In Formula One, prize money is distributed based on championship position. By being excluded from the standings, McLaren forfeited tens of millions of dollars in additional revenue. Some estimates put the total financial impact at over $150 million when you factor in all the losses. Sponsorship deals were affected. Some sponsors weren't happy about being associated with a team found guilty of espionage. Renewal negotiations became more difficult. The McLaren brand, which Ron Dennis had built on principles of excellence and integrity, was tarnished. But the real damage went deeper than money. Mike Coughlin was fired and never worked in Formula One again. His career, built over decades, was destroyed. He faced criminal charges in Italy alongside Nigel Stepney for industrial espionage. Both men would eventually be convicted and receive suspended sentences. Nigel Stepney's life spiraled into darkness. After being fired from Ferrari and convicted of espionage, he became a pariah in motorsport. On May 4, 2014, Stepney died in a traffic accident on a highway in England. He was 56 years old. Some reports suggested he'd been struggling with depression and financial problems in the years after the scandal. The man who'd helped Ferrari win championships ended his life in tragedy. Fernando Alonso left McLaren at the end of 2007, returning to Renault. His relationship with Ron Dennis was beyond repair. He'd eventually win no more world championships in his career, despite being considered one of the most talented drivers of his generation. Many believe the 2007 McLaren car was good enough to win the title, but the internal drama destroyed that chance. Lewis Hamilton stayed with McLaren and went on to win the World Championship in 2008, vindicating himself and the team. But he never forgot the 2007 season and how close he came to winning as a rookie. Years later, he'd speak about the Spygate scandal and how it affected him, saying it was one of the most difficult periods of his career. Ron Dennis remained team principal for several more years, but the scandal had changed him. The man who'd built McLaren into one of F1's greatest teams found his legacy forever linked to Spygate. He'd eventually stepped down from his role in 2016, ending an era. For Ferrari, the scandal was vindication but also a reminder of their vulnerabilities. They'd won the championship in 2007, but they'd also learned that their internal security needed improvement. The fact that someone like Stepney could walk out with 780 pages of confidential documents exposed serious flaws in their systems. The lasting impact on Formula One. Spygate changed Formula One in fundamental ways that are still felt today. First, security protocols across all teams were dramatically enhanced. Teams implemented much stricter access controls for technical information. Digital security was overhauled. Background checks for employees became more rigorous. The paddock became less friendly, more paranoid, as everyone realized that the threat of espionage was real. Second, The FIA implemented new regulations specifically designed to prevent another Spygate. Teams were required to declare in more detail how they developed their cars. Technical regulations became more prescriptive to limit the advantage that could be gained from stolen information. The era of teams pushing the boundaries of what was legal became more constrained. Third, the scandal damaged Formula One's reputation with the general public. For casual fans, the complexity of the technical regulations was hard to follow. What they understood was simple: one team stole another team's secrets and got caught cheating. It fed into criticisms that F1 was less about racing and more about engineering loopholes and corporate warfare. But perhaps most significantly, Spygate established a precedent that industrial espionage in motorsport would result in severe, career-ending consequences. No team executive, no engineer, no employee anywhere in Formula One could claim ignorance anymore. The rules were clear. The penalties were established. If you engaged in espionage, you would be caught, and you would be punished. What really happened? The theories. Now, here's where things get really interesting. Because despite all the hearings, all the evidence, all the testimony, there are still aspects of the Spygate scandal that don't quite add up. Questions that were never fully answered. Gaps in the narrative that have fueled conspiracy theories for years. Let's dig into some of these mysteries. Theory 1. Ron Dennis knew from the beginning. The official McLaren position was always that Ron Dennis and senior management didn't know about the Ferrari documents until they were confronted with evidence in mid-2007. But some people don't buy it. Think about it. Mike Coughlin was the chief designer. He wasn't some junior engineer working in isolation. He worked closely with other senior technical staff. He reported directly to people who reported to Ron Dennis. Is it really plausible that he had 780 pages of Ferrari's most confidential information and nobody noticed? That he was having detailed email exchanges with the test driver about Ferrari data and it never came up in meetings? Critics argue that Dennis must have known, or at least suspected, that something was going on. That McLaren's internal investigation after the first FIA hearing was deliberately superficial because they didn't want to find what was really there. That Dennis only went to the FIA with the emails after Alonso's blackmail threat because he had no choice. The information was going to come out anyway, and he wanted to control the narrative. The counterargument? Dennis is a lot of things, but he's not stupid. If he'd known McLaren was in possession of stolen Ferrari data, he would have shut it down immediately. The legal and financial risks were too great. The damage to his reputation and McLaren's brand would have been catastrophic. It makes more sense that Coughlin compartmentalized the information and kept it from upper management. But we'll never know for sure. Dennis has always maintained his innocence regarding prior knowledge, and there's no smoking gun proving otherwise. Theory 2. Ferrari set the whole thing up. This is the darkest theory, and it's never been proven, but it's worth examining because of how wild it is. Some conspiracy theorists believe that Ferrari deliberately leaked information to McLaren as a trap. That Stepney, despite being angry and passed over for promotion, was actually working with Ferrari security to set up McLaren in an espionage sting. The theory goes like this. Ferrari knew teams were always trying to get information about each other. They'd suspected McLaren of improper information gathering for years, but could never prove it. So they used Stepney, who had reason to appear disgruntled and believable, to feed information to Coughlin. Some of the information was real, some was deliberately misleading. Ferrari then waited for McLaren to use it, gathering evidence all the while before springing the trap. Why would Ferrari do this? To eliminate their main rival from the championship and establish dominance. To send a message to all teams about what happens when you try to spy on Ferrari. To damage McLaren's reputation permanently. The evidence for this theory is circumstantial at best. Stepney was convicted of espionage and clearly acted against Ferrari's interests. There's no documentation suggesting Ferrari management approved any kind of sting operation, and Ferrari's anger at McLaren throughout the scandal seemed entirely genuine. But the theory persists because of some odd details. Why did Stepney include so much material, 780 pages, instead of just the most valuable data? Why did some of the information later prove to be misleading or incorrect? Why was Ferrari's internal investigation so quick to identify Stepney as the source? Again, no proof. Just questions that nag at people who love a good conspiracy. Theory 3. Alonso was the real mastermind. This theory posits that Fernando Alonso orchestrated the entire scandal to benefit himself. According to this version of events, Alonso knew about the Ferrari information from early in the season. He may have even encouraged McLaren personnel to obtain it, knowing it could give him an edge over Ferrari. But when his relationship with McLaren soured and he realized he wasn't going to be treated as the #1 driver, he decided to weaponize the information by threatening to expose McLaren unless they gave him preferential treatment. Alonso was trying to guarantee himself the championship. When that didn't work, he went ahead and exposed them anyway, not out of principle, but out of revenge. If he couldn't win with McLaren, he'd make sure nobody else at McLaren won either. The evidence here is a bit stronger than other theories. Alonso definitely had knowledge of the Ferrari information. His emails prove that. He definitely threatened Ron Dennis with exposure. And his timing in going to the FIA was suspiciously convenient, coming right after the Hungary incident where he'd been penalized for sabotaging Hamilton. But calling Alonso the mastermind is probably too strong. He was a participant who knew about stolen information and stayed quiet until it benefited him to speak up. That's opportunistic and ethically questionable, but it's not the same as orchestrating the entire scandal. Theory 4. Everyone was spying on everyone. Here's perhaps the most cynical theory, but also possibly the most accurate. Every major Formula One team was engaged in some form of industrial espionage or information gathering in the mid-2000s. McLaren just got caught. In the intensely competitive world of Formula One, where millions of dollars in global prestige are on the line, teams have always pushed ethical boundaries. Engineers move between teams and bring knowledge with them. Photographers take detailed pictures of rival cars. Teams try to recruit key personnel specifically to learn about competitors' innovations. The theory suggests that what McLaren did with Coughlin and the Ferrari documents was just a more egregious example of practices that were semi-common. Ferrari might have been doing similar things with other teams. Red Bull, Renault, all the top teams. Everyone was trying to get information about their rivals. McLaren's crime wasn't that they spied. It was that they got caught with such blatant, undeniable evidence. The 780 pages were too much. The paper trail was too clear. There was no plausible deniability. This theory suggests that the FIA came down so hard on McLaren not just to punish them, but to send a message to all teams. We know you're all playing these games, but from now on, anyone caught will be destroyed. Spygate was an example being made. Is this theory true? We'll never know. Teams don't exactly publish their espionage activities. But anyone who's followed Formula One for years knows that the paddock is full of rumors about information leaks, suspicious technical developments, and employees moving between teams in suspicious circumstances. The unanswered questions. Beyond the conspiracy theories, there are legitimate questions about Spygate that have never been satisfactorily answered. Question 1. Did the Ferrari information actually help McLaren? This is the big one. The FIA convicted McLaren of possessing the information, but couldn't definitively prove they used it. McLaren maintains that their 2007 car was designed before most of the information exchange occurred and that it performed well based on their own innovations. But some of the emails suggest that McLaren did experiment with Ferrari-inspired setups. Did those experiments lead to performance gains? Did knowledge of Ferrari's development direction help McLaren make better strategic decisions about their own car development? We'll never know for certain. The McLaren MP4-22, their 2007 car, was undeniably fast. Whether it would have been just as fast without any Ferrari information is impossible to determine. Question 2. What did Lewis Hamilton really know? Hamilton has always maintained he knew nothing about the Ferrari documents. There's no email evidence linking him to discussions about the stolen information. But he was at McLaren throughout the season, working with engineers who did have access to that information. Is it really possible that his race engineers, his setup specialists, the people he talked to every day, had knowledge of Ferrari data and he remained completely unaware? Or did he know something was going on, but chose not to ask questions? Hamilton's reputation has never been seriously damaged by Spygate because there's no proof of his involvement. But the question lingers for some people. Question 3. How much did other teams know? In the tight-knit world of Formula One, rumors spread fast. When Coughlin was photocopying Ferrari documents at a public print shop, when engineers were emailing about Ferrari data, did word of this reach other teams? Did anyone at Red Bull, Renault, Toyota, or any other team hear whispers about what was happening and choose not to report it? Did they have their own reasons for staying quiet? Perhaps because they had their own secrets they didn't want exposed? The paddock can be a code of silence kind of place. It's possible that the full extent of information sharing and espionage across teams was much broader than what came out in the McLaren case. Question 4. What happened to all the documents? After the scandal broke, what happened to the physical and digital copies of the Ferrari documents? Were they all accounted for and destroyed? Or are there still copies floating around somewhere? In the digital age, information like that never truly disappears. Files get backed up. Copies get made. Did some engineer somewhere keep a copy just in case? Did that information ever surface at another team years later? There's no evidence of this, but the idea that some of the most valuable technical data in Formula One just vanished completely strains credibility. Nigel Stepney, the fall of a racing legend. Let's talk about what happened to the people at the center of this scandal, because their stories are both tragic and cautionary. Nigel Stepney's descent after Spygate was heartbreaking to watch. Here was a man who'd spent his entire adult life in motorsport. He'd worked for Ferrari during their golden years. He'd stood on podiums, celebrated championships, been part of something bigger than himself. And then, because of anger and poor judgment, he threw it all away. After being fired from Ferrari and convicted of industrial espionage in Italian courts, Stepney became unemployable in Formula One. No team would touch him. His reputation was destroyed. He tried to find work in other racing series, but the scandal followed him everywhere. Friends from his Ferrari days say he became increasingly bitter and isolated. The man who'd once been surrounded by the excitement of Formula One was now on the outside looking in, watching the sport continue without him. In his final years, Stepney gave a few interviews where he tried to explain his actions. He claimed he'd felt betrayed by Ferrari, that he'd been promised things that never materialized, that he'd given them the best years of his life and received no loyalty in return. He maintained that some of the information he gave Coughlin was deliberately false, meant to sabotage McLaren rather than help them, a final act of revenge against everyone involved. Whether that's true or just an attempt to rewrite history, we'll never know. What we do know is that Stepney never recovered from the scandal. His death in a 2014 traffic accident was ruled accidental, but those who knew him say he'd been struggling with depression and financial problems for years. The man who helped build Ferrari's dynasty ended his life forgotten and alone. It's a tragedy that should serve as a warning to anyone who thinks betrayal and espionage are victimless crimes. Mike Coughlin, the engineer who lost everything. Mike Coughlin's story is similar, but with slightly more redemption at the end. Like Stepney, Coughlin was immediately fired from McLaren when the scandal broke. His career in Formula One was over. He faced criminal charges in Italy and was convicted alongside Stepney, receiving a suspended sentence and a hefty fine. For several years, Coughlin disappeared from the motorsport world. He was reportedly working in engineering positions outside of racing, trying to rebuild his life and reputation away from the spotlight. But unlike Stepney, Coughlin eventually found his way back to motorsport. Several years after the scandal, he started doing consulting work for smaller racing teams. Nothing high profile. Nobody was going to trust him with a top-level position again, but enough to stay connected to the sport he loved. In later interviews, Coughlin expressed deep regret for his actions. He admitted that the obsession with beating Ferrari had clouded his judgment, that he'd convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really wrong because other teams were probably doing similar things, that he'd rationalized his way into making terrible decisions. The key quote from one of his interviews: "I threw away a career that people would kill for because I wanted to win so badly that I stopped thinking about right and wrong. I thought about what I could get away with. That's a mistake I'll regret for the rest of my life." Coughlin's story is a reminder that in high-pressure, competitive environments, good people can make catastrophically bad decisions. He wasn't a villain at the start. He was just a man who let ambition override ethics, and by the time he realized what he'd done, it was too late. Fernando Alonso, the whistleblower who became a villain. Fernando Alonso's role in Spygate is perhaps the most complex and morally ambiguous of anyone involved. On one hand, Alonso exposed wrongdoing. He brought evidence of espionage to light, forcing McLaren and the FIA to confront what had happened. If you believe in accountability and justice, he did the right thing. On the other hand, his motivations were entirely selfish. He only came forward after trying to blackmail his own team for preferential treatment. He was fine staying quiet about the Ferrari information as long as he thought it might help him win the championship. It was only when McLaren refused his demands that he decided to become a whistleblower. The Formula One community has never fully forgiven Alonso for how he handled 2007. His relationship with McLaren was permanently destroyed. He left at the end of the season and wouldn't return until 2015, in a second stint that was even more disastrous than the first. His relationship with Lewis Hamilton was also irreparably damaged. The two men who should have been teammates became bitter rivals. Even years later, you can see the tension between them when they're forced to interact at press conferences or public events. Alonso went on to have an incredible career, but he never won another world championship after 2006. Many people believe that the 2007 McLaren was good enough to win the title, but the internal warfare and the scandal destroyed that opportunity. Some see it as karmic justice. Alonso's own actions cost him a championship. In more recent years, as he's gotten older and perhaps wiser, Alonso has spoken more openly about 2007. He's admitted that his relationship with Hamilton was toxic and that both of them made mistakes. He's acknowledged that the situation at McLaren got out of control and that he played a role in that. But he's never fully apologized, never expressed true regret for how he handled things. For Alonso, it seems to be a chapter of his life he'd rather forget than reconcile. Lewis Hamilton, the innocent who carried the burden. If anyone deserves sympathy in the Spygate scandal, it's Lewis Hamilton. Here was a 22-year-old kid in his rookie Formula One season, driving at the highest level of motorsport, competing for the world championship, and suddenly finding himself at the center of the biggest scandal in the sport's history. Hamilton maintained from day one that he knew nothing about the Ferrari documents. The evidence supports this. His name doesn't appear in any of the incriminating emails or text messages. He wasn't CC'd on the communications. He wasn't part of the discussions. But the scandal affected him enormously. The media scrutiny was intense. Every race, every press conference, Every interview became about Spygate. People questioned whether his rookie success was legitimate or built on stolen Ferrari data. The pressure was crushing. And then there was the China incident, where a strategy error cost him the race and, potentially, the championship. Hamilton has never publicly blamed McLaren for that mistake, but you have to wonder, was the team's judgment impaired by the stress of the scandal? Were they making mistakes they wouldn't normally make because everyone was exhausted and emotionally drained? Losing the 2007 championship by 1 point, in a season where he'd driven brilliantly and should have won, haunted Hamilton for years. He's spoken about how it motivated him, how it made him stronger, how it taught him that he couldn't rely on anyone but himself. In 2008, Hamilton won his first world championship with McLaren, proving that his talent was real and his 2007 performance was legitimate. It was a form of redemption, not just for him, but for McLaren as well. Today, Hamilton is one of the greatest drivers in Formula One history, with 7 world championships. But he's never forgotten 2007 and what the Spygate scandal did to what should have been a joyous rookie season. In interviews, when he's asked about that year, you can still see the pain and frustration in his eyes. Ron Dennis, the leader who fell on his sword. Ron Dennis's handling of Spygate defined the final chapter of his McLaren career. Dennis was a complex figure in Formula One. He built McLaren into one of the sport's greatest teams through obsessive attention to detail, unwavering standards, and a commitment to excellence. He was known for being difficult, demanding, and sometimes arrogant. But he was also known for his integrity. When the scandal broke, Dennis could have taken several paths. He could have fought the allegations, denied everything, and forced the FIA to prove their case beyond any doubt. He could have thrown Coughlin under the bus and claimed total ignorance. He could have tried to cover up the extent of the information sharing. Instead, when he discovered the emails that proved McLaren's guilt, he went to the FIA voluntarily. He knew it would destroy his team's championship chances. He knew it would result in massive fines and penalties. But he chose honesty over self-preservation. Some people see this as Dennis doing the right thing. Others see it as a pragmatic move. He knew Alonso was going to expose the information anyway, so he got ahead of it to control the narrative and minimize the damage. Whatever his motivations, Dennis paid a heavy price. The $100 million fine and the loss of the Constructors' Championship were devastating to McLaren. The team's reputation was damaged. Sponsors were unhappy. The board of directors was furious. Dennis remained team principal for several more years, but his authority was diminished. The absolute control he'd once wielded was gone. In 2009, he stepped back from the day-to-day running of the team. In 2016, he was forced out completely after conflicts with other shareholders. The man who defined McLaren for decades left the team not in triumph, but in a bitter corporate dispute. Spygate, while not the only factor in his eventual departure, had weakened his position and given his opponents ammunition to use against him. In interviews since leaving McLaren, Dennis has been asked repeatedly about Spygate. He's always maintained that he did the right thing by going to the FIA. That integrity matters more than winning. That McLaren's 2007 car was designed legitimately and would have been just as fast without any Ferrari information. But you can hear the regret in his voice. Regret that it happened on his watch. Regret that he didn't catch it sooner. Regret that one of McLaren's best chances at a championship was destroyed by a scandal that should never have happened. Ron Dennis built an empire, and Spygate didn't destroy it, but it certainly tarnished it. That's a burden he'll carry for the rest of his life. The Italian criminal case. While the FIA was handing down its verdicts and penalties in the world of motorsport, the Italian legal system was pursuing its own case against Stepney and Coughlin for industrial espionage. Italian law takes intellectual property theft very seriously, especially when it involves high-profile companies like Ferrari. The Medina prosecutors who took on the case were determined to make an example of this situation. The criminal trial began in 2008 and dragged on for years. Both Stepney and Coughlin faced charges that could have resulted in substantial prison time if convicted. The prosecution had to prove not just that documents were taken, but that there was criminal intent to harm Ferrari's business interests. The evidence was overwhelming. The 780 pages of documents were cataloged and presented. The email exchanges were entered into the record. The testimony from the print shop employees was heard. Ferrari's lawyers meticulously laid out the case for how the stolen information had damaged their competitive advantage and their business. The defense attorneys for Stepney and Coughlin tried various strategies. They argued that the information shared was not as valuable as Ferrari claimed. They suggested that some of it was already in the public domain through technical regulations and photographs of cars. They pointed out that McLaren had been penalized already and that criminal prosecution was excessive. But the judges weren't buying it. In 2010, both Stepney and Coughlin were convicted of industrial espionage. They received suspended sentences, 20 months for Stepney, 20 months for Coughlin, meaning they wouldn't serve actual prison time unless they committed another crime. They were also ordered to pay substantial fines and legal costs to Ferrari. The exact amounts were never made fully public, but estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of euros each. The convictions were upheld on appeal. Both men now had criminal records for industrial espionage, making it virtually impossible to work in any high-level engineering or technical role ever again. The civil lawsuits. Parallel to the criminal case, Ferrari also pursued civil litigation against everyone involved. They sued Stepney for breach of contract, theft of trade secrets, and damage to Ferrari's reputation. The civil case sought monetary damages far exceeding what the criminal courts could impose. They sued Coughlin for receiving stolen property and for his role in the conspiracy. Again, massive damages were sought. And they sued McLaren, not just for the actions of their employees, but for negligence in preventing the espionage from happening. Ferrari argued that McLaren had a responsibility to maintain proper security protocols and to ensure their employees weren't engaged in illegal information gathering. These civil cases were settled out of court for undisclosed amounts. Legal experts believe Ferrari received millions in compensation from the various parties, though the exact figures remain confidential as part of the settlement agreements. The settlements included non-disclosure agreements preventing anyone involved from discussing certain aspects of the case. This is why, even years later, many details about what exactly was communicated and how the information was used remain murky. The impact on employment law in motorsport. One of the lasting legal impacts of Spygate was how it changed employment contracts in Formula One. After the scandal, teams dramatically revised their employment agreements with technical staff. New clauses were added specifically prohibiting the possession or use of confidential information from competing teams. Penalties for violations were spelled out in detail. Non-compete clauses became more aggressive. Employees moving between teams found themselves subject to much more scrutiny. Teams would conduct extensive interviews to ensure that new hires weren't bringing confidential information from their previous employers. In some cases, employees were required to serve gardening leave, periods where they were still employed by their old team but couldn't work, to ensure any information they had would be outdated by the time they joined a new team. The legal concept of intellectual property quarantine became standard practice. When an employee with sensitive knowledge joined a new team, they would be isolated from certain projects for a period of time to prevent any chance of contamination. All of this made the Formula One job market more complicated and more legalistic. But it also made industrial espionage much harder to pull off. The risk was now clearly established. The legal framework was in place to prosecute offenders. And everyone knew that getting caught meant the end of your career and potential criminal charges. The regulatory response. The FIA, Formula One's governing body, used Spygate as an opportunity to implement sweeping new regulations designed to prevent future industrial espionage. First, they created more detailed technical documentation requirements. Teams had to submit extensive paperwork about how they developed their cars, including timelines and design philosophies. This made it easier to spot if a team suddenly implemented innovations that seemed to come from nowhere, a potential sign they'd acquired information improperly. Second, they increased the resources dedicated to technical scrutiny and investigation. The FIA hired more technical staff and gave them broader authority to inspect teams and investigate suspicious developments. Third, they established clearer whistleblower protections. If employees suspected improper activity, they now had confidential channels to report it without fear of retaliation. The hope was that another Mike Coughlin would be reported by a concerned colleague before 780 pages of documents could change hands. Fourth, they implemented what became known as the Spygate clause in the sporting regulations. This clause explicitly stated that possession of a competitor's confidential information, even without using it, was grounds for disqualification and severe penalties. Intent didn't matter. Use didn't matter. Possession alone was enough. These regulatory changes remain in effect today, and they've been expanded over the years as new challenges have emerged. The digital age has brought new risks: cyber espionage, hacking, digital theft, and the FIA has had to adapt continuously. But the foundation laid after Spygate remains. The message sent by the $100 million fine and McLaren's exclusion from the championship still resonates. Teams know that industrial espionage is the third rail of Formula One. Touch it, and you'll be destroyed. How the press handled Spygate. The media coverage of Spygate was intense, global, and often sensationalized. This wasn't just a racing story. It had all the elements of a blockbuster thriller. Corporate espionage, betrayal, massive fines, star athletes caught in the crossfire. It was irresistible to journalists. In the UK, where McLaren is based, the tabloids went into overdrive. Headlines screamed about cheating, scandal, and shame. The broadsheets were more measured but equally fascinated, publishing lengthy analyses of the legal issues and the implications for British motorsport. Ron Dennis, never comfortable with media scrutiny even in the best of times, was subjected to brutal questioning. Reporters camped outside McLaren's headquarters. Employees were doorstepped and asked for quotes. The pressure was relentless. Lewis Hamilton, as the young British rookie caught up in the scandal, became a particular focus. The press was torn between wanting to celebrate him as a national hero and questioning whether his success was legitimate. Every interview turned into an interrogation about what he knew and when he knew it. The British public's reaction was interesting. Many people rallied around Hamilton and McLaren, seeing them as victims of overzealous prosecution. The $100 million fine seemed excessive to a lot of people, more about politics than justice. There was a sense that the FIA, led by Max Mosley, who had his own subsequent scandals, was using McLaren as a scapegoat. In Italy, the coverage was very different. Ferrari is a national treasure in Italy, and the fact that someone had stolen their secrets was treated as a crime against the nation itself. The Italian press portrayed Ferrari as the victim and McLaren as villains who tried to steal Italian engineering excellence. The contrast between UK and Italian coverage highlighted how much national pride was invested in these teams. This wasn't just about racing. It was about national identity, cultural supremacy, and which country could claim to build the best cars. The conspiracy theories in the media. As details of the scandal emerged, conspiracy theories flourished in the motorsport press and online forums. Some journalists suggested that the FIA had it out for McLaren for political reasons. Max Mosley and Ron Dennis reportedly had a difficult relationship. Was the harsh penalty motivated by personal animosity rather than the severity of the offense? Others pointed out that Ferrari held enormous political power within Formula One. They had special veto rights over regulation changes. They received preferential financial treatment. Was the Spygate verdict just another example of Ferrari using their influence to eliminate competition? Still others questioned why. If industrial espionage was such a serious concern, only McLaren was being investigated. What about all the other teams? Were they really all operating with complete integrity? Or was McLaren just unlucky enough to get caught? The conspiracy theories were fueled by the fact that Formula One has always been a politically complex environment. The teams, the FIA, the commercial rights holders, all have competing interests and agendas. Nothing is ever quite as simple as it appears on the surface. But while conspiracy theories make for entertaining reading, the hard evidence against McLaren was overwhelming. They possessed 780 pages of Ferrari documents. Multiple employees had knowledge of this information. They discussed using it. The case wasn't built on speculation. It was built on emails, documents, and testimony. The Internet Age and Spygate. Spygate occurred at an interesting moment in media history. It was 2007. Social media was just beginning to emerge. Facebook existed, but wasn't yet dominant. Twitter had just launched. YouTube was still new. But online forums dedicated to Formula One were incredibly active. Sites like Autosport forums, F1 Technical, and various fan communities became ground zero for discussions about the scandal. These forums were fascinating because they showed the full range of fan reactions in real time. Some fans were outraged at McLaren's actions. Some defended them as victims of excessive punishment. Some blamed Alonso for ratting out his own team. Some praised him for his integrity. The internet also allowed for unprecedented analysis of the technical aspects of the case. Amateur engineers and racing enthusiasts pored over photos of McLaren and Ferrari cars, looking for evidence that designs had been copied. Every wing angle, every bargeboard configuration, every aerodynamic element was scrutinized and debated. This crowdsourced investigation didn't uncover any smoking guns, but it showed how engaged fans were with the scandal. This wasn't just entertainment. People cared deeply about the integrity of the sport and wanted to understand what had really happened. The Internet Age also meant that the scandal had a permanent record. Unlike previous F1 controversies that faded from memory over time, Spygate was documented in extensive detail online. Articles, forum posts, videos, and analyses remain accessible today, allowing new generations of fans to learn about the scandal in depth. The long-term impact on McLaren's brand. For McLaren, one of the most painful aspects of Spygate was the damage to their brand reputation. Ron Dennis had spent decades building McLaren's image as the ultimate professional team. They were known for their attention to detail, their engineering excellence, their immaculate presentation. McLaren wasn't just fast, they were classy. Spygate shattered that image. Suddenly, McLaren was associated with cheating, espionage, and scandal. The word integrity, which Dennis had used repeatedly to describe his team, now seemed hollow. Sponsors were uncomfortable. Tag Heuer, Mercedes-Benz, Vodafone, all the major McLaren sponsors had to decide whether to continue their association with a team found guilty of industrial espionage. Some stayed, but renegotiated their deals. Some privately expressed concerns to McLaren management. McLaren's road car business, which was just beginning to expand in the mid-2000s, was also affected. The McLaren automotive brand was built on the idea of engineering purity and excellence. Having their racing team convicted of stealing information undermined that message. It took years for McLaren to rebuild their reputation. Winning the 2008 championship with Lewis Hamilton helped. Continuing to produce competitive cars helped. Staying out of further scandals helped. But even today, nearly 2 decades after Spygate, the scandal comes up whenever McLaren is discussed. It's part of their history in a way that can't be erased. For a brand that prided itself on perfection, that permanent stain is perhaps the most lasting punishment of all. The psychology of espionage. Spygate provides a fascinating case study in why smart, successful people engage in industrial espionage even when they know the risks. Let's start with Nigel Stepney. Here's a man who'd achieved enormous success. He was at the top of his profession. He'd been part of one of the most dominant teams in Formula One history. He had financial security, respect from his peers, and a legacy to be proud of. So why did he throw it all away? The psychological answer is surprisingly simple: perceived injustice. Stepney felt he deserved a promotion that he didn't get. He felt that Ferrari didn't appreciate him. He felt that after giving them decades of his life, they owed him more. This sense of being wronged, of being treated unfairly, created a justification in his mind. It's a thought process that goes something like, they didn't hold up their end of the bargain, so why should I hold up mine? They don't deserve my loyalty. Once that mental justification is in place, the next steps become easier to rationalize. Stepney wasn't stealing from Ferrari. He was taking what he deserved. He wasn't betraying them. They'd betrayed him first. The information he was sharing wasn't theft. It was compensation for years of undervalued work. Psychologists call this moral disengagement, the process by which people convince themselves that unethical actions are actually acceptable in their specific circumstances. Mike Coughlin's psychology was different, but equally instructive. Coughlin wasn't motivated by anger or revenge. He was motivated by ambition and competition. In Formula One, there's intense pressure to find even the tiniest competitive advantage. Teams spend hundreds of millions of dollars searching for improvements measured in hundredths of a second. Engineers are evaluated on their ability to make cars faster. Winning is everything. In that environment, Coughlin's thought process likely went, everyone is pushing the boundaries. Everyone is trying to find information about their rivals. If I don't do this, we'll fall behind. This is just how the game is played at this level. This is a rationalization through normalization. Coughlin convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really that different from standard industry practices, that the line between aggressive competition and espionage was blurry, that his actions were within the accepted norms of Formula One, even if they technically violated rules. Both of these psychological patterns, perceived injustice and normalization of deviance, show up repeatedly in corporate espionage cases across all industries. The organizational failures. Spygate also highlights how organizational failures enable individual bad actors. Ferrari's failure was in security protocols. How does someone walk out of your facility with 780 pages of confidential technical documents? Where were the access controls? Where was the document tracking? Where was the oversight? The truth is that Ferrari, like many successful organizations, had become complacent. They dominated Formula One for years. They trusted their employees. They didn't think anyone would betray them so blatantly. That trust, that complacency, created vulnerabilities that Stepney exploited. After Spygate, Ferrari completely overhauled their security systems. Document access was restricted and tracked. Digital systems were implemented to monitor who accessed what information and when. Background checks became more rigorous. The era of trust was over, replaced by an era of verification. McLaren's organizational failure was different. Their failure was in culture and oversight. How did Mike Coughlin, the chief designer, have 780 pages of Ferrari documents without anyone noticing? How were emails discussing Ferrari data being sent without raising red flags? How did their internal investigation after the first FIA hearing miss the evidence that investigators later found easily? The answer suggests either inadequate oversight of senior personnel or, more cynically, willful blindness. Maybe McLaren management didn't want to look too closely because they suspected what they might find. After Spygate, McLaren also implemented major organizational changes. They created clear protocols for information handling. They established reporting mechanisms for employees who suspected improper activity. They made compliance with ethical standards a key performance indicator for all staff. These changes across both Ferrari and McLaren illustrate an important principle. Organizations that don't actively work to prevent espionage will eventually become victims of it. Good intentions aren't enough. Trusting your employees isn't enough. You need systems, oversight, and a culture that makes espionage both difficult and culturally unacceptable. The cost-benefit analysis of espionage. One of the questions that lingered after Spygate was, from a pure cost-benefit perspective, was McLaren's espionage worth it? Let's run the numbers. Potential benefits. Technical information worth possibly hundreds of millions in R&D costs. Faster car development. Potential championship wins, worth millions in prize money and sponsor bonuses. Competitive advantage for multiple seasons. Actual costs. $100 million fine. Loss of all constructor points, worth tens of millions in prize money. Damage to sponsor relationships. Legal costs, millions in fees. Criminal convictions for key employees. Reputational damage lasting years. Even if McLaren had gotten away with it initially, the risk-reward calculation doesn't make sense. The potential benefits would have had to be enormous to justify the risks. And once they got caught, the costs far exceeded any possible benefit. This is actually true for most industrial espionage. Studies of corporate espionage cases consistently show that the costs of getting caught almost always exceed the benefits gained. Companies that engage in espionage are making catastrophically bad bets. So why do they do it? Often, because the people making the decision to engage in espionage aren't doing a rational cost-benefit analysis. They're operating on emotion, anger, competitiveness, fear of falling behind, and they're discounting the likelihood of getting caught. It's the same psychology that leads people to commit other white-collar crimes. They convince themselves either that they won't get caught, or that the rules don't really apply in their situation, or that everyone else is doing it too, so it must be okay. Lessons for other industries. While Spygate occurred in Formula One, the lessons apply across industries where competition is intense and intellectual property is valuable, which is basically every industry in the modern economy. Lesson 1. No organization is immune. McLaren and Ferrari were two of the most sophisticated, well-managed organizations in motorsport. If it could happen to them, it can happen to anyone. Tech companies, pharmaceutical firms, defense contractors, and financial institutions all are vulnerable to insider threats and espionage. Lesson 2. The insider threat is real. The greatest security risk isn't hackers or foreign spies. It's your own employees. People with legitimate access to sensitive information who, for various reasons, decide to misuse that access. Defending against insider threats requires a combination of security protocols, cultural values, and monitoring systems. Lesson 3. Detection matters as much as prevention. You can't prevent all espionage, but you can detect it early before massive damage is done. The fact that Stepney was able to compile 780 pages of documents suggests Ferrari's detection systems failed. Organizations need to implement monitoring that can identify suspicious access patterns, unusual document sharing, and anomalous behavior. Lesson 4. Response must be swift and severe. When espionage is discovered, the response must be immediate and overwhelming. Half measures and quiet settlements send the message that espionage is a calculated risk worth taking. The $100 million fine and criminal prosecution sent a different message. If you engage in industrial espionage, you will be destroyed. That's the only message that creates effective deterrence. Lesson 5. Culture matters more than rules. All the policies and procedures in the world won't prevent espionage if the organizational culture tolerates cutting corners and bending rules. Organizations need to cultivate a culture where ethical behavior is valued and rewarded, where speaking up about concerns is encouraged, and where the pressure to win doesn't override the pressure to do things right. The modern espionage landscape. Spygate occurred in 2007, practically ancient history in terms of technology and security threats. If it happened today, it would probably look very different. Physical documents would be less common. Everything would be digital. The espionage would likely involve hacking, phishing, malware, and cyber infiltration rather than photocopying documents at a print shop. The methods would be more sophisticated. State-sponsored hackers, zero-day exploits, advanced persistent threats. The terminology and techniques have evolved dramatically, but the human elements would be the same. Someone on the inside with access and motivation. Someone willing to betray trust for money, revenge, or competitive advantage. Someone who convinces themselves that what they're doing is justified. Modern Formula One teams, like modern corporations everywhere, spend enormous resources on cybersecurity. They encrypt communications. They compartmentalize information. They monitor network activity for signs of intrusion. They conduct regular security audits. But they also know that the weakest link is still human. Social engineering, manipulating people into giving up access or information, remains one of the most effective espionage techniques. And defending against that requires not just technology, but training, awareness, and culture. Spygate was a wake-up call for Formula One and for industries watching from the outside. It showed that industrial espionage wasn't a hypothetical threat or a plot device from movies. It was real, it was damaging, and it could happen to the best-run organizations. The question isn't whether your organization will face espionage threats. The question is whether you'll detect and stop them before they cause catastrophic damage. Lewis Hamilton's journey from the Spygate scandal to becoming Formula One's joint most successful driver is one of the great redemption stories in sports. After losing the 2007 championship by 1 point, a loss that still haunts him, Hamilton came back in 2008 with a vengeance. He won the Drivers' Championship in the final corner of the final lap of the final race of the season, overtaking Timo Glock in treacherous conditions to snatch 5th place and the points he needed. It was one of the most dramatic championship victories in F1 history, and it proved that Hamilton's 2007 performance had been legitimate talent, not the product of stolen Ferrari data. Hamilton stayed with McLaren until 2012, winning another championship in that time. Then, in a move that shocked many people, he left McLaren to join Mercedes, a team that hadn't won a championship in decades and was considered a risk. That gamble paid off spectacularly. When Formula One's regulations changed dramatically in 2014, Mercedes had built a dominant car. Hamilton won 6 more world championships with Mercedes between 2014 and 2020, tying Michael Schumacher's record of 7 titles. As of 2024, Hamilton is considered one of the greatest drivers in Formula One history. He holds records for most pole positions, most wins, and most podiums. He's a global superstar, known far beyond racing circles. But here's what's interesting. Hamilton has never forgotten 2007. In interviews, he still talks about that season with a mix of pride and pain. Pride that he nearly won as a rookie. Pain that Spygate and the internal team politics cost him what should have been his first title. The scandal shaped Hamilton's approach to his career. He learned that he couldn't rely on teams completely, that he needed to control his own destiny, that politics and corporate interests could undermine performance. Those lessons made him stronger and more independent. Hamilton eventually returned to McLaren, not as a driver, but as an ambassador. The wounds healed, at least partially. But the 2007 season remains a complex chapter in his story, inseparable from his identity as a driver. Fernando Alonso's career after Spygate is almost tragic in how it didn't fulfill its promise. After leaving McLaren at the end of 2007, Alonso returned to Renault, the team where he'd won his 2 championships. But the magic was gone. Renault was no longer competitive. Alonso drove brilliantly, but couldn't fight for titles. He moved to Ferrari in 2010, beginning what should have been a dream partnership. Alonso driving for Ferrari, the most successful team in F1 history and one of the sport's most iconic brands. It seemed destined for success, and in many ways, it was successful. Alonso drove some of the best races of his career at Ferrari. He dragged cars that had no business fighting for championships into title contention. In 2010 and 2012, he came agonizingly close to winning the championship, losing both times in the final race of the season. But he never won that elusive 3rd title. Despite his talent, despite driving for Ferrari, despite 5 years of trying, the championship eluded him. He left Ferrari in 2014 and, in a decision that still baffles F1 fans, returned to McLaren for a second stint. This turned out to be even worse than the first. McLaren, now partnered with Honda engines, was hopelessly uncompetitive. Alonso spent 3 years driving cars that frequently broke down and were lapped by the leaders. The frustration broke him. Radio messages of Alonso screaming about how slow the car was became viral memes. His relationship with McLaren soured again. In 2018, he quit Formula One, frustrated and seemingly done with the sport. Since then, Alonso has raced in other series: IndyCar, Le Mans, Dakar Rally, searching for the competitive satisfaction that Formula One could no longer provide. He returned to F1 in 2021 with Alpine and then moved to Aston Martin, showing he still has the speed and skill. But the championships? They never came. Many F1 observers believe that 2007 was Alonso's best chance at a 3rd title. The McLaren car was good enough. He was in his prime. But the internal warfare with Hamilton and the Spygate scandal destroyed that opportunity. Alonso himself has admitted in recent interviews that he handled 2007 poorly, that his ego got in the way, that he should have focused on racing rather than politics. Whether he fully grasps his role in the scandal and its consequences is unclear, but there's definitely regret there. He's still racing in Formula One as of 2024, now in his 40s, still fast, but no longer a championship contender. His legacy is complicated. A brilliant driver who won 2 titles, but could have won more if he'd made different choices in 2007. Ron Dennis's departure from McLaren was slow, painful, and ultimately bitter. In the immediate aftermath of Spygate, Dennis remained as team principal. He oversaw Hamilton's 2008 championship victory. He guided McLaren through the financial and reputational recovery. He maintained his position of authority, but behind the scenes, the cracks were growing. The $100 million fine had strained McLaren financially. Board members and shareholders were unhappy with how the scandal had been handled. Dennis's autocratic management style, which had been tolerated during the successful years, became a liability. In 2009, Dennis stepped back from day-to-day management of the racing team, though he remained chairman of McLaren Group. It was presented as a planned transition, but those close to the situation say it was a forced move. Over the following years, Dennis focused more on McLaren's road car business and other projects. But his relationships with other shareholders and board members continued to deteriorate. Corporate politics that had been simmering for years came to a head. In 2016, Ron Dennis was placed on gardening leave and eventually forced out of McLaren completely. The man who'd run McLaren for over 30 years, who'd won championships, who'd built the team into a global brand, was removed from his own company in what amounted to a corporate coup. The official statements talked about different visions for the company's future. The reality was that Dennis had made enemies, and Spygate had weakened him enough that those enemies could strike. Since leaving McLaren, Dennis has remained largely out of the public eye. He's pursued other business interests, stayed involved in automotive and technology ventures, but his racing days are over. He's given occasional interviews where he reflects on his time at McLaren, always maintaining that he did the right thing regarding Spygate, always insisting that integrity mattered more than winning. But you can hear the hurt in his voice when he talks about how it ended. McLaren was his life's work, and having it taken from him, with Spygate having played a role in weakening his position, is clearly painful. McLaren as an organization survived Spygate, though it changed fundamentally in the process. The years immediately following the scandal were difficult. They won the 2008 Drivers' Championship with Hamilton, but then entered a decline. From 2009 through 2012, they were competitive but not dominant. After 2012, they began a slow slide down the competitive order. The disastrous second Fernando Alonso era from 2015 to 2017 was a low point. McLaren was at the back of the grid, embarrassingly slow, a shadow of its former glory. But the team didn't give up. They rebuilt. They secured new sponsorships. They changed engine partners. They invested in infrastructure and personnel. Slowly, painfully, they clawed their way back toward competitiveness. As of 2024, McLaren is once again a top team in Formula One. They're winning races, fighting for championships, back where they belong at the front of the grid. The Spygate scandal is history, still remembered but no longer defining. The current McLaren team is very different from the Ron Dennis era. The management structure is different. The corporate culture is different. There's less autocracy, more collaboration. The perfectionism remains, but tempered with pragmatism. Interestingly, McLaren now works to use the Spygate scandal as a teaching moment for new employees. It's part of their corporate ethics training. Here's what happened. Here's what we learned. Here's how we make sure it never happens again. The fact that McLaren can openly acknowledge the scandal and use it constructively suggests they've moved past the shame and defensiveness that characterized the immediate aftermath. The team survived because institutions are bigger than individuals. Despite the scandal, despite the personnel changes, despite the competitive ups and downs, McLaren Racing endures. The papaya orange cars are back at the front. The dream of championships continues. Ferrari's story after Spygate is less dramatic because they were the victims rather than the perpetrators. But their response to the scandal shaped the organization for years. Ferrari won the 2007 Constructors' Championship after McLaren was excluded. Kimi Räikkönen won the driver's title. It should have been a moment of pure celebration, but the scandal cast a shadow over everything. Ferrari's leadership was angry, not just at McLaren, but at the entire situation. The fact that their confidential information had been compromised, that one of their long-serving employees had betrayed them, that their technical advantage had been shared with rivals, all of it was humiliating. They completely overhauled their internal security. Access to technical areas was restricted. Document handling protocols were revolutionized. Employee vetting became much more rigorous. Ferrari became almost paranoid about protecting their information. This paranoia extended to their interactions with the press and other teams. Ferrari became more secretive, more isolated, more suspicious. The warmth and openness that had characterized some eras of Ferrari's history gave way to a fortress mentality. On track, Ferrari remained competitive through the late 2000s and into the 2010s. They won races, fought for championships, and maintained their position as one of F1's top teams. But they didn't dominate the way they had in the early 2000s. The Schumacher era was over, and the new era was more competitive. The shadow of Spygate lingered in odd ways. Anytime Ferrari suspected another team of improper information gathering, they were quick to complain to the FIA. They'd been burned once and were determined not to let it happen again. As of 2024, Ferrari is still one of Formula One's iconic teams. They're competitive, they're investing heavily in their future, and they're chasing that next championship. Spygate is a footnote in their long history, important but not defining. What Ferrari learned from the scandal is that even the most successful organizations are vulnerable. That trust must be earned and verified. That security isn't paranoia, it's necessity. These lessons have served them well in the years since. Nearly 2 decades after the scandal, Spygate's impact on Formula One is still visible in countless ways. The regulatory framework around technical information sharing has been completely rewritten. The penalties for industrial espionage have been established and reinforced. Teams know exactly what will happen if they're caught possessing confidential competitor information. The culture of Formula One changed too. The paddock, once a relatively friendly place where engineers from different teams would chat and socialize, became more guarded. Paranoia about information security became standard. Taking photos of other teams' cars became more restricted. The free flow of information that had characterized earlier eras of F1 was replaced by suspicion and secrecy. Employee mobility between teams became more complicated. When an engineer moves from one team to another, both organizations are hyper-aware of the information that person might carry. Contracts include stricter non-compete and non-disclosure clauses. Gardening leave periods, where employees transitioning to rival teams are paid to stay home for months, became standard to prevent their knowledge from becoming outdated. The relationship between teams and the FIA also changed. Before Spygate, there was a sense that the FIA was reluctant to seriously punish major teams for fear of damaging the sport's reputation. The $100 million fine and exclusion from the championship showed that the FIA would drop the hammer when necessary. This empowered them in subsequent disputes with teams. Technical development in Formula One became more transparent by necessity. Teams now have to document their development processes much more thoroughly. The FIA conducts regular audits. The goal is to make it obvious where innovations came from, making it harder to hide stolen intellectual property. The scandal also accelerated Formula One's move toward more standardized parts. If certain components are the same across all teams, there's less to steal. While F1 remains a constructors' championship where teams build their own cars, the number of standardized components has increased partly as a response to Spygate-era concerns. Spygate became a case study in business schools and corporate ethics courses around the world. Why? It illustrates so many important principles about organizational behavior, ethics, and risk management. Principle 1. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. McLaren had policies against possessing confidential competitor information, but their culture of winning at all costs created an environment where some employees felt those policies were negotiable. The lesson: written policies don't matter if your culture doesn't support them. Principle 2. The cover-up is worse than the crime. McLaren might have survived if they'd immediately come clean when the Ferrari documents were discovered. Instead, their incomplete internal investigation and misleading testimony to the FIA in the first hearing made everything worse. The lesson: transparency and honesty, even when painful, are better than concealment. Principle 3. Individual actions have organizational consequences. Mike Coughlin acted largely on his own, but McLaren paid the price. This illustrates the principle of organizational liability. Companies are responsible for their employees' actions, even when those actions aren't explicitly authorized. The lesson: organizations must actively prevent misconduct, not just react to it after the fact. Principle 4. Trust is built slowly but destroyed instantly. McLaren spent decades building a reputation for integrity. Spygate destroyed that reputation in months. Rebuilding took years. The lesson: reputational damage from ethical failures is disproportionate and long-lasting. Principle 5. The illusion of control. Both Ferrari and McLaren believed they had control over their confidential information. Stepney's betrayal showed Ferrari they didn't. Coughlin's recklessness showed McLaren they didn't. The lesson: organizations often overestimate their information security and underestimate insider threats. These principles extend far beyond Formula One. They apply to any organization dealing with confidential information, competitive pressure, and human beings who sometimes make terrible decisions. Let's play out some alternative scenarios. What if key moments in the Spygate saga had gone differently? What if Trudy Coughlin hadn't called Ferrari? If Mike Coughlin's wife hadn't discovered the documents and made that phone call, would the espionage have ever been uncovered? Possibly not for years. Coughlin might have continued receiving information from Stepney. McLaren might have used more of it. The competitive balance of Formula One could have been fundamentally altered. Or Ferrari might have discovered the leak through other means, noticing that McLaren was implementing suspiciously similar innovations, or catching Stepney accessing files he shouldn't have. Either way, Trudy Coughlin's discovery and her decision to reach out accelerated the scandal's exposure. What if Ron Dennis had fought the FIA instead of cooperating? Dennis could have refused to hand over the incriminating emails. He could have fought the investigation every step of the way, using lawyers to delay and obstruct. Some team principals might have taken that approach, but the evidence would have come out eventually, and McLaren's penalties might have been even harsher for non-cooperation. Dennis's decision to come clean, while painful, probably minimized the long-term damage. A protracted legal battle might have destroyed McLaren completely. What if the FIA had stripped Hamilton and Alonso's points? The FIA chose not to penalize the drivers in the 2007 championship, but they could have. They could have excluded Hamilton and Alonso entirely, giving the title to Raikkonen by default. If they'd done that, the scandal would have been even bigger. Hamilton's promising career would have been tainted from the start. Alonso would have lost any sympathy he had. The championship would have lacked legitimacy. Formula One's reputation would have taken a bigger hit. The FIA's decision to leave the drivers' championship alone was probably wise, even if it was controversial at the time. What if McLaren had won the 2007 championship? Imagine if, despite the scandal, Lewis Hamilton had won the drivers' title in Brazil. Or if McLaren had retained their constructors' points. The scandal would still have happened, but the narrative would have been very different. Ferrari would have argued that McLaren won through cheating. There would have been even more pressure for harsh penalties. The championship might have been stripped retroactively. The entire season would have been delegitimized. In some ways, the fact that McLaren didn't win made the resolution cleaner. They were punished, but there wasn't a tainted championship to deal with. So, after everything, was the outcome of Spygate just? Did the punishment fit the crime? Arguments that justice was served. McLaren possessed 780 pages of confidential Ferrari information. Multiple McLaren personnel knew about and discussed this information. They misled the FIA in the initial hearing. The $100 million fine and championship exclusion sent a necessary message. Criminal convictions held individuals accountable. Arguments that the punishment was excessive. There's limited evidence that McLaren actually used the Ferrari information in their car design. The $100 million fine was unprecedented and possibly disproportionate. Other teams may have engaged in similar behavior, but weren't caught. The punishment damaged Formula One's reputation as much as the crime. Drivers who weren't involved, particularly Hamilton, suffered consequences. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. McLaren was guilty of possessing confidential information and misleading regulators. They deserved significant punishment. But whether that punishment needed to be the largest fine in sporting history is debatable. What's not debatable is that the punishment achieved its goal. No team has attempted anything similar since. The deterrent effect was total and permanent. In that sense, regardless of whether the punishment was proportionate, it was effective. If Spygate happened today, how would it be different? First, the information theft would almost certainly be digital. No photocopying at print shops. It would be hacked data, stolen files, and encrypted communications. The evidence would be harder to find, but also harder to completely erase. Second, the media coverage would be even more intense. Social media would explode with theories, accusations, and reactions in real time. Every development would trend on Twitter. Reddit would have megathreads analyzing every detail. The pressure on everyone involved would be crushing. Third, the legal consequences might be even more severe. Cyber espionage laws have become stricter. International cooperation on digital crimes has improved. Prosecution might involve multiple countries and law enforcement agencies. Fourth, the sports politics would be even more complex. Formula One is now owned by Liberty Media, an American company. The political dynamics between the commercial rights holder, the FIA, and the teams have shifted. The response to a Spygate-level scandal would have to navigate even more competing interests. But the human elements would remain the same. Ambition, revenge, competition, betrayal. These are timeless motivations. The methods of espionage evolve, but the reasons why people engage in it don't change. Modern Formula One teams are better prepared to prevent and detect espionage than they were in 2007. But they're not invincible. Somewhere, right now, there's probably an employee at an F1 team who has access to information they shouldn't have, who feels underappreciated or underpaid or bitter about something, who's rationalizing decisions that could lead to the next big scandal. That's the sobering reality. Spygate could happen again. Not in exactly the same way. But the conditions that enabled it, human nature, competitive pressure, valuable intellectual property, those conditions still exist. At its core, Spygate isn't really about cars or racing or technical regulations. It's a human story about decisions, consequences, and how quickly things can spiral out of control. Think about Nigel Stepney at the beginning of 2006. He was a successful man with a great job, respect from his peers, and financial security. 2 years later, he was unemployed, convicted of industrial espionage, and unemployable in the industry he loved. What happened in between was a series of decisions, each one seeming small at the time, that added up to catastrophe. That first conversation with Mike Coughlin, where something inappropriate was shared. The decision to compile documents instead of walking away. The choice to keep going even when he must have known it was wrong. Each step led to the next, and before he knew it, he was too deep to turn back. Mike Coughlin's story is similar. An ambitious engineer who wanted to win, who convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't really that bad, who got caught up in the moment and forgot to think about consequences. By the time he was photocopying 780 pages of Ferrari documents at a print shop, he was so far down the wrong path that there was no way back. Fernando Alonso, dealing with ego and competition, made decisions that seemed justified in the heat of battle but looked very different in hindsight. Trying to blackmail his own team, then exposing them when that didn't work. Winning nothing and losing respect. Lewis Hamilton, the rookie caught in the crossfire, racing at the highest level while a scandal swirled around him, losing a championship he deserved, carrying that burden for years. Ron Dennis, trying to do the right thing when confronted with evidence of wrongdoing, but paying a price for it anyway. Building an empire over decades and watching it slip away partly because of a scandal he didn't create but couldn't prevent. These are all human stories. Stories of ambition, pride, anger, fear, and trying to make the right decisions when the pressure is intense and the stakes are enormous. If there's a lesson to take from Spygate, it's this: integrity matters. Not just as an abstract concept, but as a practical, day-to-day reality. Nigel Stepney would have been better off accepting that he wasn't going to get promoted and either staying at Ferrari in his current role or leaving to find opportunities elsewhere. The path he chose destroyed him. Mike Coughlin would have been better off trusting McLaren's engineering team to develop a competitive car without stolen information. The path he chose ended his career. Fernando Alonso would have been better off focusing on racing instead of team politics and blackmail. The path he chose cost him championships. McLaren would have been better off with stronger oversight and a culture that made espionage unthinkable. The path they went down cost them $100 million in years of reputation damage. Integrity isn't just about being a good person. It's about making smart decisions that protect your future. The short-term advantage from cutting corners or breaking rules is almost never worth the long-term consequences. Why does Spygate continue to fascinate people nearly 2 decades later? Why are we still talking about it? Why does it deserve this deep dive? Because it has everything a great story needs: high stakes, complex characters, moral ambiguity, dramatic reversals, and consequences that echo through the years. It's a story about the price of ambition, about what happens when winning becomes more important than how you win, about the fragility of reputation and the weight of consequences. It's a reminder that in any competitive field, sports, business, politics, the temptation to cheat is always there. The pressure to find advantages, to push boundaries, to do whatever it takes to win. And the line between aggressive competition and unethical behavior can become blurry when the stakes are high. Spygate showed what happens when that line gets crossed. When good people make bad decisions. When organizations fail to prevent misconduct. When secrets don't stay secret. And it showed the cost: careers destroyed, reputations tarnished, relationships broken, millions of dollars lost. All because of decisions that probably seemed justifiable at the time to the people making them. If you remember one thing from this story, remember this: the path to scandal is paved with small decisions that seem insignificant at the time. Stepney didn't wake up one day and decide to commit industrial espionage. He made a series of small decisions: talking to Coughlin, sharing a little information, then sharing more, then compiling documents. Each step seemed manageable, but they added up to a catastrophe. That's how most scandals happen. Not through one big, obviously wrong decision, but through a series of small compromises that accumulate over time. The way to avoid becoming part of the next Spygate is to recognize those moments of compromise when they happen. When someone asks you to do something that makes you uncomfortable. When you're tempted to cut a corner because everyone else is doing it. When you're rationalizing behavior that you know isn't quite right. Those are the moments that matter. The small decisions that seem insignificant but that determine whether you end up as a cautionary tale or someone who walked away from temptation. Even today, as Formula One races around the world, as new teams compete and new scandals emerge, Spygate remains present as a ghost haunting the paddock. When teams develop innovative technical solutions, rivals scrutinize them for signs of improper information sharing. When engineers move between teams, everyone watches to see if their new team suddenly implements similar technologies to their old team. When investigations are launched into technical infractions, Spygate is referenced as the standard for how seriously Formula One takes intellectual property theft. The regulations that were created in response to Spygate remain in force. The organizational changes that teams made after the scandal are still in place. The careers that were ended serve as warnings to anyone tempted to cross ethical lines. In quiet moments, when engineers and team principals are being honest, many will admit that Spygate changed them, made them more cautious, made them think twice before pushing boundaries, made them remember that the consequences of getting caught far exceed any temporary advantage gained from cheating. And perhaps that's Spygate's greatest legacy. Not the $100 million fine or the championship exclusion or the criminal convictions, but the permanent reminder that in Formula One, as in life, integrity matters. That there are lines you don't cross, no matter how badly you want to win. That the trust of your peers, the respect of your competitors, and your own self-respect are worth more than any trophy. The cars are faster now than they were in 2007. The technology is more advanced. The sport has evolved in countless ways. But the fundamental lesson of Spygate remains as relevant as ever. Some victories aren't worth the cost. Some advantages aren't worth the risk. And some secrets, once exposed, can never be hidden again. So that's the story of Spygate. The scandal that shook Formula One to its core. The $100 million espionage case that changed motorsport forever. 780 pages of stolen documents. 2 careers destroyed. 1 team is exiled from a championship. Millions of dollars lost. Reputations tarnished. Relationships broken. And lessons learned that echo through the sport to this day. From a photocopier in a Surrey print shop to the FIA hearing rooms in Paris. From ambitious engineers to fearless drivers to corporate executives making impossible decisions. From the heights of success to the depths of scandal and back again. This is Formula One at its most dramatic, most human, and most cautionary. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. This story needed to be told in full, with all its complexity and all its consequences. Because scandals like Spygate don't just happen. They're built through hundreds of small decisions made by real people under real pressure. And understanding those decisions, those pressures, and those consequences, that's how we make sure history doesn't repeat itself. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into Formula One's most controversial moments. Leave a comment with your thoughts on Spygate. And remember, in racing as in life, how you win matters as much as whether you win. Until next time, drive fast, but race clean.